Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Good morning everyone. Welcome again to this course on History of English Language and Literature. And today's session we begin talking about perhaps this greatest figure not in Elizabethan literature itself but in world literature itself, William Shakespeare. Shakespeare is perhaps the best known literary writer of not just his period but also of the entire world literature. And in fact many of you might know that even the ones who have got little inclination towards theatre, poetry or any kind of literary writing might have heard about Shakespeare. That's the kind of impact that he has had on not just in literature but also in world culture for the last few centuries. And in fact when we begin talking about William Shakespeare, one of the first things that comes to our mind is who is William Shakespeare. Let's begin with some very trivial details about the scholarship on Shakespeare. In fact, there is a lot of mystery about who really Shakespeare was and what kind of an author he was, in the sense that the absence of historical records has made his personality, his corpus of writing quite mysterious in terms of actual authorship. In fact, a particular branch of study itself exists in English literary studies known as authorship studies, which debates and deliberates upon the actuality of Shakespeare's writing, whether Shakespeare actually wrote those plays or not. In fact, some of those concerns about the various disputes about authorship we also looked at in the previous session when we engaged with the university wits in general. So, that is about the debates about Shakespeare's authorship, but in this lecture we move on with the assumption, which most of the recent historians also share, that Shakespeare himself actually wrote most of his plays. Maybe there were collaborations, maybe there were lost plays, but nevertheless the man did exist and his dramatic genius is beyond question. So, we move ahead with this assumption. And another interesting trivia about his personality, some of you might have noticed this opening scene in the movie Shakespeare in Love, where he tries to put his signature in many different ways. This detail in the movie is actually based on facts, and that is very interesting given the fact that the man who penned almost 37 plays and a number of sonnets and a few other uncredited and lost plays, maybe he had a problem in spelling his name correctly. So, this is an instance of about 6 examples of Shakespeare's own handwriting, which historians have recovered from signatures from legal documents. These were mostly contracts that he signed with particular acting companies, and one is from his will. And very interestingly, there is no standard spelling that the linguistic experts and handwriting experts could discover from these varied kinds of signatures that Shakespeare is said to have used. So, these are the different spellings that he himself perhaps had been using, and even the veracity of these signatures and whether Shakespeare himself actually signed them or whether he had another clerk or doing all these jobs for him, it is not yet clear. But it is very interesting to note that during his own lifetime, the standard spelling that we now use, William Shakespeare, was never used. He himself never had used it, and we do not find any other records using his name with this spelling either. So, in that sense it was a very interesting and a very multifaceted kind of life that he led. So, beyond these many trivialities about his life and many disputes about his life, in fact there are but apart from these many trivialities about his life and these many disputes about historical veracity, one needs to move on with the assumption that as we said earlier, Shakespeare did exist, and also his drama is of supreme genius, not just during the Elizabethan times but in the world class literature itself. These are some of the instances of the earlier manuscripts available which were published posthumously after his death, and we do not find them using the spelling that we contemporarily use. So, moving on from that, we need to take a brief look at his early life. And in fact, Shakespeare is said to have been born on 23rd April 1564, and I use the phrase said to have quite advisedly because there are no actual records of his birth available, and there are church records of baptism. So in that sense, it is assumed that maybe he was born in and around 23rd April in Stratford upon Avon. He was born as the son of an alderman, so his childhood may not have been that difficult. He was one of the 8 children of his father, and he is said to have hailed from a fairly well-to-do family in that sense. So maybe he also this is the birthplace which is now a center of tourist attraction in London, and he is also said to have enjoyed a fairly sound education in terms of schooling. He perhaps went to this grammar school which was quite popular and quite decent in Stratford during these days. During those days, and he may have been taught Latin and arithmetic, but there are no actual school records to prove whether he went or not. But there is this assumption that like all other children of his class, he may have enjoyed the sound education, but he was certainly not very learned in that sense. He never went to a university, and he when he came to London, as we noted even in the discussion of university wits, he was perhaps the only one who arrived in London with the hope of making it big in theatre, making it big in writing without having had a university education. So Ben Jonson, one of his contemporaries, later wrote about him. He knew small Latin and less Greek. So this is how he was looked down upon by some of his more learned contemporaries. But the ironical fact remains that he became more famous and more achieved in terms of his literary merit and his dramatic craft at a later point of time. And we get to know that financial misfortunes had overtaken his family. This was around 1577, but one does not know the real nature of the misfortunes and the circumstances in which his childhood was based. But following that, perhaps it was not an easy time for him. There are also some records which prove that he got married to Anne Hathaway in 1585. There are no actual marriage records, but one knows about this marriage due to some available records from the church. And there's a record of baptism of a daughter and a set of twins, and one of them who also dies a little later. And strangely enough, by the time Shakespeare was of 21 years, he had already fathered 3 children. So it was not a easy life to begin with. He had a lot of financial misfortunes, and he was not really making it big in that small town of Stratford. And we find him leaving for London in 1587. And the reasons for taking off to London is not really known. And some of the historians feel that he was going to be arrested for poaching in somebody else's property. So one is not too sure whether he fled Stratford for London in order to escape an impending arrest, or whether he decided to deliberately move to London to pursue more fortunes over there. So if we try and record Shakespeare's journey to London from Stratford upon Avon, this is the kind of journey that he had undertaken. So for a very long time, we realize that when Shakespeare began to make it big in London, he used to almost shift between Stratford and London, and some historians even feel that he led a double kind of a life, because he was a very successful professional in London, and but his home front always continued to be based in Stratford. And if we talk about this journey in terms of distance, it's only 133 kilometers, which might sound quite simple today. But during those days, as Pat Rogers, the historian, puts it, it was a journey of several days, unless you were rich and extravagant enough to hire post horses. So we do not have any historical records to show that Shakespeare's family had moved to London, but he perhaps used to commute up and down. One is not too sure about the domestic details. So in that sense, he was a contemporary of the university wits as well, about whose families also we do not know much about. Another thing is that one is not too sure about the exact year in which Shakespeare arrived in London, the exact year in which he started participating in theatrical activities, so on and so forth. Pat Rogers says, in what year exactly Shakespeare was drawn into the orbit of the Metropolitan Theatre, we are not sure. So we begin discussing his dramatic career with this uncertainty. But there is enough evidence that by 1592 he was writing and acting in London, and he was fairly established and fairly fairly well known in London circles by the time he was at the age of 28. And we also recalled in the discussion of university wits that there was this Robert Greene who had written quite unkindly about the arrival of a new fellow in the London dramatic circus. So this is perhaps there's a conjecture that this is perhaps Shakespeare. So in 1592, at the age of 28, he was important enough to merit abuse from a famous playwright of the period, Robert Greene. And by 1594, he was one of the leading actors in London, and there is enough evidence to show that he had appeared with William Kemp and Richard Burbage, who were two of the major actors of those period. In fact, it is really generally said that during the Elizabethan times, many of them used to flock these theatres to watch their favorite actors in stage. And in such a within such a setting, for some person like Shakespeare to make it really big in terms of acting abilities, in terms of his writing skills, in terms of his dramatic technique, that was quite an achievement. And by 1595, we know that he was in the payroll of Lord Chamberlain's company of actors, and this was in fact the most respectable and most coveted company in Elizabethan times. And they had the rare distinction of performing within the court. There is even evidence that Shakespeare himself had performed in front of the Queen herself a couple of times. So Lord Chamberlain's company was the most well known, and Shakespeare, once he had been part of Chamberlain's company, we note that he had not performed or he had not written for any other company after that. And this same company was renamed as King's Men after James I takes over as the King of England. So we also get to know about which we shall be seeing in detail a little later as well. We get to know that the theatre companies, their performances and everything continue to be at the mercy of the government, the monarch, the town council, so on and so forth. Many of these details we shall be coming back to when we look at Elizabethan theatre in detail. By 1597, there is evidence to show that he had already authored 15 of the 37 plays, and that's quite a tremendous achievement for someone who had arrived in London with very little fortune or very little prospects. If we survey his career in more detail, if we try to describe Shakespeare, he was not just a dramatist, he was not just a playwright, he was not just an actor. He was many things put together. In fact, he was a theatre owner, he was an entrepreneur, he is considered as a very successful businessman who knew the market sense and who could cater to what the market wanted. So in that sense, he is perhaps one of the first playwrights who realized the kind of success that one could reap out of theatre and literature in a more financial and revenue based terms. So we can even call him as one of the dramatists who could come up with box office hits one after the other. And so in that sense, Hudson in fact refers to him as a practical man of affairs, and he compares Shakespeare with that of he compares Shakespeare's genius with that of Chaucer, and says he was no dreamer like Chaucer. And this is proved by the fact that Shakespeare reached London poor and friendless, but by the time he left London, he was rich and he was respected. And now we know England in fact owes much of its popularity, much of its cultural heritage to this singular figure, William Shakespeare. And his output was prolific. In fact, he was the object of envy of most of his contemporaries, because he was producing almost a couple of plays a year, and all of them were quite successful as well. So in contemporary terms, if we think of a movie director who is coming up with at least 2 successful nationwide hits, and that also if he repeats this success, he or she repeats this success one after the other for many consecutive years, that is quite an achievement. So this is what Shakespeare had. He achieved literary merit through this, he achieved the court's favour, he was popular, and he was making a lot of money. So by the time he begins to be quite an established figure in London, we know that he had amassed a lot of wealth and he had become extremely famous in London circles. And we find him coming up as a very smart entrepreneur and a shrewd businessman as well. As soon as he realized the kind of revenues that these theatres were turning out, we find him becoming the shareholder of two very important theatre companies, playhouses of the period, the Globe and the Blackfriars. So this is how the structure of the Globe looked like. When we can already see that this is quite a massive structure. It's very elaborate. In fact, it is quite elaborate than the playhouses of today. So we will be looking at all of these technical features in detail when we talk about Elizabethan drama. So there is also evidence to show that he purchased property in Stratford in London, and in that sense he is also one of the earliest figures in London to realize the potential of real estate dealing. So we find him investing heavily in property, and also he could identify and also he had an eye for this market, eye for business. So we find him becoming extremely successful and extremely famous even during his lifetime. But this his life was not just a bed of roses. We find a lot of domestic tragedies hitting him one after the other. He is, in fact, his dramatic career is also marred by continuous deaths in his family. His son dies initially, followed by his father, his younger brother Edmund, who was also an actor in London, and his mother also dies in 1607. And this had a major impact on his career and his personal life in general. By 1610, we find him quietly retiring back to Stratford-upon-Avon, and when he goes back to Stratford, if you remember earlier when he had left for London, he had to almost flee London because there was an impending arrest perhaps, or maybe he was running away from the misfortunes that had fallen him and his family. But when he goes back to London to retire and spend some quiet time over there, he is the richest man over there. We find him purchasing the largest house in Stratford and settling over there. And just like his entire life was clouded in mystery in certain ways, his death is also quite mysterious. He is said to have again died on 23rd April 1616, which happens to be the documented birthday of William Shakespeare as well. This is also again a conjecture because there are burial records which show that he was buried on 25th April. So given the conventions of the day, the burial used to happen 2 days after death. So there is this conjecture that he was born on 23rd April and he died on 23rd April as well. And talking about Shakespeare's genius, it was there was no way in which one could compare him to his contemporaries because he had no university education, and he was not he did not have the kind of background that many of the other literary writers of those period had. And his learning and his craft, it was not the reflection of the trained and accurate scholar. In fact, we find him gathering knowledge, gathering life material from different sources, and it's a very miscellaneous assortment of different kinds of experiences we find at a later point. And at the same time, he was not free from the influences of his times. His plays reflect very strong influence of the classicism of the Renaissance period, and also we get to know that he had access to a lot of ancient Greek and Roman literature through translations, and some of the plays they also seem to be have been borrowed from certain other languages. So he was trying to keep himself abreast with the latest happenings and the knowledgeable things of the times. And last but not the least, one cannot ignore the influence that Elizabethan England had on him, because we have noted multiple times that this was a charged and stimulated atmosphere in London during those times. So he was influenced by all of these things collectively, and it's very difficult to pinpoint what exactly turned this man into quite an exemplary figure of those times. And interestingly, though he had performed many plays in London, though he was quite famous, he had taken a name in London as an actor, as a playwright, as a poet, so on and so forth, he himself did not take any kind of effort to get anything published. This, some of them feel perhaps, being a successful playwright himself, being a successful person who was putting plays on stage, maybe he was weary of publishing his plays. There was this risk of piracy because drama was getting increasingly competitive in England. So everyone had to make sure that their plays remained their own and they were not pirated by someone else. So maybe for this reason Shakespeare did not actively try to bring out any kind of publication in his name. But there is also this other assumption that he was too busy staging plays one after the other, preparing the actors and putting the plays on stage, that he did not really have the time to sit down and have a proper script. There are a lot of anecdotes about how casually he used to name his plays, how casually he used to frame his scripts. So this man had his eye only on the stage and not on the literary things that would go into the pages. So in that sense, he had never published anything, and there are no surviving manuscripts in his own name, which is quite ironical and quite strange given the kind of success, popularity and fame that he achieved at a later point. So how do we access his plays? So some of his friends, two of them in particular, they had come out with a collection much after his death. This was known as the first folio. This is in fact for all Shakespeare scholars and all Shakespeare lovers, this is a very important document, because we do not have any other kind of access to the plays of Shakespeare apart from the fact that they were staged at some point in London. So John Hemmage and Henry Condell, they were good friends of Shakespeare. They were also actors and they were part of King's Men for a very long time. So they knew Shakespeare very well and had been a part of most of his dramatic ventures. So they brought together in 1623 a collection known as the First Folio, and one does not know about how original all of these plays were, whether they had to amended their plays, whether they had brought about some changes, because they had it was all based on the partly from memory, partly from the plays which were still being staged. So let us not go into those details, which is clearly beyond the scope of our discussion. And it is said that in the contemporary only 233 copies of the 750 original first folios are now available. Rest of them were perhaps lost, or some even feel that they could be available in someone's private collections. So this is how the first folio, the first page of the folio looked like. So if you look at the title, it's Shakespeare's Comedies, Histories, Tragedies. Interestingly, this is how the scholarly discussion on Shakespeare's works have been framed as well. It talks about these three major different genres, and this folio in that sense has been a major scholarly framework as well in all the other kinds of discussions on Shakespeare to follow. And this portrait of Shakespeare that we find over here, this is known as the Dreshout portrait, because it was made by Martin Dreshout, and this is one of the two portraits which this in fact is one of the two accurate portraits of Shakespeare which is available till date, and the other one being the his bust, which is erected near his graveyard. And this one is said to be accurate because of the assumption that his friends had brought it out, and perhaps they could maybe they had found it closer to real life than many other portraits of that time. So this is the most accurate and the most trustworthy portrait of Shakespeare as we have it today. And but at the same time, if you just Google Shakespeare's name, you would find that there are different versions and different kinds of portraits which are available. So if we talk about this vast corpus of Shakespeare's works, in span of 24 years, this is what he had come out with. He had 2 narrative poems to his credit, 154 sonnets, 37 plays. So this is quite a big achievement, and some of them feel that there are also a few lost plays. There are a couple of incomplete ones. There are certain plays with Shakespeare collaborated with certain others and were not documented. So this is really a vast corpus of work, and many historians feel that this is the greatest single body of work available in literature. To embark upon a discussion on Shakespeare's work, we need to devote an entire lecture for that, and which is precisely what we are going to do in the next lecture. So with this, we come to the end of this session. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next class.